But as I say, it's a real pleasure to be here for this briefing, FinTech, RegTech and Compliance. And we've called it a beginner's guide simply because in this session, and it is a short session, we're going to be finished within 30 minutes. Within the session, what we're looking to do is really just to introduce some of these key concepts of financial technology, RegTech, and also particularly how these relate to compliance. So without waiting any further, let's get underway. Let's make a start. So very first thing I want to do, actually, just to introduce the session, is just to get a snapshot of your perspective on FinTech. And so I want to ask you a question. And in a moment, I'm going to give you the opportunity to respond to this. It's very simply this: how would you describe your firm's current involvement in FinTech and or RegTech? And we've given you some options. Now, I should say before I go any further, all of these questions are anonymous, so I don't know what your response will be. I'm going to put that up in front of you now. So you should have that on your screen in front of you. Do please make a selection that reflects, as you see it, your firm's current situation in relation to FinTech and or RegTech. Okay, the votes are starting to come in. As I said, I don't know who's voting. It is anonymous, but I do just see the numbers of votes. So we'll give people another few seconds just to complete their voting. Okay, we're getting up towards half of you. Few more seconds, just those of you, if you've not voted, do please make your selection. That would be great. Okay, still some votes. We're up to about 3/4 of you. And we're going to end it there. Now, let me show you the results, which actually are really interesting, and just show us, as I say, a snapshot of who we have on the briefing this morning. A real variety, from some of you saying none, no exposure, no involvement in FinTech or RegTech, about 20% of you saying your firm is actually a FinTech or RegTech firm. Interestingly, the largest single answer being my firm is a mainstream firm, but actually we do make some sort of use of FinTech and or RegTech. Okay, so that's a really interesting snapshot just to start us off this morning. Let's then just go on very briefly to some definitions. First of all, what do we mean by FinTech? Well, this definition is from the Financial Stability Board, and it's a very broad definition: technology-enabled innovation in financial services. Now, as I've said, that's a very broad definition. It includes a very wide range of services or products, and again, just to name a few, so Teller, the payment gateway, we've got things like Apple Wallet, robo-advice. So in the context of wealth management, we have firms that are developing robo-advice solutions, and of course, digital currencies, including cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and others. So our starting point is just to recognize that FinTech as a category is very broad. Well, let's zero in then. Let's just focus in for a moment on RegTech. Now, again, just a useful definition. What do we mean by RegTech? Use of technologies to solve regulatory and supervisory challenges. So in other words, what we're talking about there is the use of FinTech, the use of innovative technology in the context of compliance or regulation, used by firms and others to try to solve or address their regulatory challenges. In other words, RegTech is a particular form of FinTech. And then just to go one stage further, we'll make a mention over the course of the morning again of SupTech. And some of you will be familiar with this term. Again, a definition: the use of innovative technology by financial authorities. So in other words, we have, again, a special use of FinTech, where we're looking at the use by supervisors, by central banks, by other regulators of FinTech and other forms of innovative technology. So that's our starting point in terms of our definitions. But what then are the specific issues relating to compliance? Why is it worth us taking half an hour to talk about this as an issue? I think there are three issues for us to be aware of. The first one is simply the question of the use of RegTech by firms, within firms, for compliance purposes. And so we'll just explore that for a few moments. We also want to think, though, about the issues that are generated for how we supervise or oversee our firm's use of FinTech. And there are some specific issues that I think arise in relation to that issue. And then lastly, we're going to look at the regulatory response and how regulators are using and how they're responding to the growth of FinTech, and specifically making use of SupTech. So those are the three topics that we're briefly going to run through over the course of our time this morning. I'm going to start with that first one of use of RegTech. So why might firms, why might compliance teams or compliance functions be using RegTech? Well, this list is taken from a very interesting report. Actually, I'll mention this again towards the end, from the Institute of International Finance, RegTech in Financial Services, that gave just a series of examples of the ways that compliance teams, compliance functions are using RegTech. And what's really interesting when you look at this, some of them I think you will recognize and may well be using in your own firm. So for example, probably one of the most widespread, number 4, identity verification. Use of, for example, biometrics and others, more sophisticated methods of doing due diligence. But of course, that's not the only one. We have things like transaction monitoring. Interesting one, number 1, risk data. So the aggregation, in other words, the bringing together of relevant risk data from across an organization, and then being able to use data visualization, for example, to be able to explore that data and present that data. There are others there, I won't go through them all. Just one interesting one at the end, number 7. What we traditionally have always called horizon scanning in compliance contexts. So the idea, in other words, of looking out and seeing what's coming in terms of regulatory developments. Some of you will know some regulators are looking to develop machine-readable regulation. And again, that ties in with this use of RegTech by firms. Okay, so we've got a number of reasons, number of ways in which firms might be using RegTech within their compliance teams, within their compliance operations. But let's go on to think about the particular issue that I've already highlighted, the issue for compliance of oversight by compliance and by senior management of firms' use of FinTech. Now, I think this presents a whole set of challenges for compliance, and I want to use a particular case study of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now, many of you will be familiar with this terminology, but if you're not, let's just make sure you understand what we're referring to here. So artificial intelligence, this is the stuff of science fiction. It's what we see in films and movies all the time. Development of systems that can perform tasks that have traditionally required human intelligence. Now, of course, at an extreme level, we're thinking about robots and all of those things, but let's simplify this down. We could be talking, in other words, about a system that can perform a task in terms of monitoring transactions, for example, that would normally have needed some sort of human intervention or human intelligence. But there's a particular use of AI, machine learning. And again, if you're not familiar with this, it's important just to understand what we're referring to here. So machine learning is the design of a system that can learn, that can optimize over time from experience. And so, for example, what we might do is set it a task. We might have fed it a whole set of data initially to prime the system, and then it can go away and taking in more data, it can learn over time. Okay, that's as much as we need to know. For the purposes of this morning, there's a lot more we could say, but that's as much as we need to know at this point. But well, how does this relate to compliance? Well, let's pause for a moment. How are firms using these technologies at the moment? And these are firms within financial services. How are they using these types of technology? Well, the Financial Stability Board did a report looking specifically at this issue of use cases. How are firms using these? And I'm not going to go through them all, but I listed them just to give you a sense of the variety of uses. So if you're from a bank, okay, if you're looking over that list, you might be seeing something like credit scoring. Okay, there are banks that are using AI and machine learning as part of their credit scoring process to determine, are we going to lend or pricing for lending. Chatbots. We've mentioned this is quite a theme. We see this used in various different contexts, but again, firms are using these to respond to simple queries from clients. We've got things like portfolio management. Okay, so generation or review of investment ideas as part of the investment decision-making process. We've got issues around trading, so doing impact analysis for large trades, for example. There's a well-known case study of a particular firm that used machine learning to optimize its derivatives margin calls process. So I'm just making the point, whatever type of firm you're from, you may well not be using it, all of these, you may not be using any of them, but just to give you a sense of the fact that firms across multiple sectors are using these technologies in various different ways. Okay. So let's come back to our question, what does this have to do with compliance? Earlier in the summer, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, published a consultation report on the use of AI and ML. And what was very interesting was it published a list of risks and harms, or potential risks and harms. Now, as I looked over those and I thought about the time I spent a lot of time training compliance teams, compliance officers, what was fascinating about those, as I looked down that list, was that obviously several of them stood out to me as issues that compliance is routinely involved in, that very much feel like home territory for compliance. Compliance inevitably is involved in governance and oversight. Issues like outsourcing. Again, very much a compliance-related issue, something that compliance would have concerns with, would be wanting to address. Again, ethical concerns, that's an area that compliance is often very directly involved in. But then just look at one or two of the others. If you think about your compliance function, is it involved in anything relating to algorithm development or data quality, data bias? And so what we're saying here is that, or at least the IOSCO consultation is suggesting, is that there's this potential set of risks, and some of them compliance is well equipped to maybe interact with, and others that are perhaps much more challenging for compliance to address. The report goes on, and this is perhaps the really crucial part for me. Regulators, it says, IOSCO, those of you that don't know of it, it's an international body, but it's not a regulator itself. So it is recommending that regulators require firms to have the right people, the right skills, the right experience, the right expertise to oversee this. And then it went on specifically, compliance and risk management functions should be able to understand and challenge the algorithms that are produced. I'll just let that sink in for a moment. The basic issue is something that is repeatedly expressed by regulators. In other words, if you're in compliance or risk management, you should have an understanding of the business that you're overseeing, that you're supervising. Okay, that's been routine for regulators. But let's just think about the implications of that. Are we realistically in compliance and risk management? Are we realistically in a position not only to understand, but also to be able to challenge the business, challenge business management around some of the issues that we've just been talking about, the design of algorithms, data quality, data bias, the ethics that arise in relation to the use of AI? So I think it's a very challenging set there of questions for compliance teams and compliance functions just to reflect on. Okay, I appreciate we're going at speed. I'm very mindful of time and finishing on time, so we are just giving these topics just an overview. But the third topic we're just going to briefly touch on is regulators' use of technology, and we use this term SupTech. So we have FinTech as the overall. We have RegTech, in other words, the use of FinTech in a compliance or regulatory context. When it's used by regulators, we talk about SupTech. First thing just to point out, in terms of the region, the GCC, is the overall response to FinTech. Some of you will know of GFIN. It's the Global Financial Innovation Network. It's a group of regulators internationally that seek to promote and support financial innovation. Now, all of the regulators that we have on the screen there are members. Now, I know that doesn't cover everyone in the region, but it is just an interesting snapshot of the fact that generally the region has proven to be very supportive, very encouraging of the development of FinTech. But let's look at one or two specific examples, and these are only examples. I could have given you very many more, but let's take, for example, those of you that based in or have dealings with Saudi Arabia. FinTech Saudi, you may know of, is a partnership between SAMA and the CMA, looking to encourage the development of FinTech and RegTech. Just a quick tip here, if you're not too familiar with FinTech, if this is relatively new to you, what I would really encourage you to have a look at, FinTech Saudi publishes a set of cheat sheets. And again, I'm not going to go through them, I just wanted to illustrate them for you. These are just quick primers on different aspects of FinTech. So whether or not you're in Saudi, it's all available on the website, it's just a tip. I would recommend you have a look at those if that's something that's going to be useful for you. Obviously, those of you in the ADGM, you'll know that the ADGM has its own regulatory framework for crypto assets. We have the innovation testing license and the whole sandbox, the hive, sorry, I should say, in DFSA. And then in Q8, we have the regulatory sandbox. Now, I could have gone on. There are multiple examples across the region. I just wanted to give you the point that right across the region, there are regulators who are putting forward initiatives, seeking to encourage and develop, as well as to regulate the use of FinTech and RegTech within their jurisdictions. Okay. One final example, and this I thought was very interesting. Some of you will be familiar with this. This was the statement from the UAE federal authorities on the impact of COVID-19. And in that statement, the authorities jointly made this statement: the UAE supervisory authorities encourage the use of technology to the fullest extent possible. In fact, I heard one senior regulator in the GCC recently say that the pandemic has hyper-accelerated the adoption of technology by firms. Just a really interesting observation and perspective from regulators on the way firms are responding in the context of the pandemic. Okay. So that's how regulators are responding. One final point on this: how are regulators themselves using SupTech? Well, again, I think the sheer variety of this is very striking. This is taken from a Financial Stability Institute report that looks at the evolution of SupTech, the increasing adoption of SupTech and its more complex forms, but everything from, for example, reporting. So some of you will know some jurisdictions are now adopting automated reporting. So rather than having a very manual process for firms to submit reports to the regulators, some regulators actually at the point where they are pulling data from firm systems. Virtual assistants, that covers everything from, for example, chatbots. We've already talked about machine readable regulation, through to market surveillance, and even through to micro and macro prudential. There's been some interesting work on that, on the use of technology in prudential supervision. So a huge variety, in other words, around use of SupTech by regulators. One quick point, and it's just a chat comment that's come in. I don't have time to talk about it in a lot of detail, but someone has asked it. It's a great question. Ethical concerns. What are the particular ethical concerns? I'll just flag up for you. And if it's something you want to follow up with me after the event, please do. But there are some really interesting issues around the use of AI and some of the inherent biases that can be built into artificial intelligence systems. And there's some interesting articles. What the dark heart at the center of AI is one. So if you want to follow up with me on that after the session, I've just had a query come in through the chat. So again, do just be aware that is a real issue that compliance functions are going to need to get to grips with. Okay, so after I whiz through those three topics, what else do I need to say? Just one other topic I just wanted to mention, just simply because in a briefing about FinTech, I didn't think I could not mention crypto assets. But it is just going to be a very brief mention of them. If this is something that's of interest, please just get in touch with us, let us know. We'd be very happy to do another session just looking at these and talking about these in a bit more detail. But I think from a compliance perspective, what do we need to appreciate? Well, I think it's really important that we can clearly distinguish between virtual assets and blockchain. In the context of compliance and our understanding of FinTech. Because virtual assets, of course, includes cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoins, as well as some of you will know there are other asset types as well. And I think this is definitely fair to say that opinions on virtual assets like cryptocurrencies vary enormously. Some of you may have strong feelings yourself, or you'll know those who are either very, very positive and pro something like Bitcoin, and others who are much more skeptical. Whatever your view of particular cryptocurrencies, I think what we do have to recognize is there are some specific regulatory and compliance challenges that arise around the use of cryptocurrencies. Now that's, as I say, that's not to be overly negative. It's just recognizing, and if you're wanting to follow up on this, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, has come out with new guidance in the last year on this. So there are issues just to be aware of and to consider. But I think it is important that we can separate that out from blockchain, which is essentially the technology which underpins cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. It's a form of distributed ledger technology, and what's very important to recognize is actually there are many potential uses for blockchain, and some of you will have heard, for example, of smart contracts. That's an example that go beyond cryptocurrencies. So don't please just see this whole area as simply relating to Bitcoin and what's our view on Bitcoin. It really is far broader than that, and actually a lot of the interesting developments are arguably happening in the area of use of blockchain, separate from cryptocurrencies. Okay. So in what feels like not a lot of time, we've gone through an awful lot there. And as I've said, you know, if it is something you want to follow up with us, please do get in touch. But there's one final question, actually, almost final question that I'd like to ask you. And it's this. How big an impact do you think FinTech and or RegTech is going to have on the role of compliance function in your firm? I don't mean just compliance in general. I mean, in your firm, what difference is it going to make over the next 5 years? Fast forward 5 years, 2025, how different is compliance going to be? So let me put that question in front of you. I'll give you just a few seconds just to respond to that. Wow. Okay, we've got nearly 20 of you voting so far. Very strong view. Okay, I'm going to give you a last few seconds. Okay, we've had nearly 3/4 of you. Okay, let me show you the results. Really interesting. 80% of you think it will have a significant impact. Another 15% of you expect it's going to transform the role of compliance. Now, look, a completely unscientific response, obviously just drawn from the people who are on the briefing this morning, but really interesting. Of those of you that are here, 95% of you think that FinTech or RegTech are going to either have a significant impact or actually transform the role of compliance over the next 5 years, which is a really interesting position to be in. Just a few final points. We appreciate we're getting towards the end. By the way, I do want to give people an opportunity at the very end. I'll hold on if there are particular questions you want to ask. But in addition to publications from local regulators, I'd really recommend any of these. These are documents that I've referred to over the course of the session. They make really interesting reading if this is an area you want to explore in more detail. So I think all of these are really helpful. I'd really encourage you, again, to dip into those. There's also the cheat sheets that I talked about from from Saudi, the FinTech unit there. So again, there's lots out there if you do want to engage with this as an issue. If you'd like us to do a further briefing, we've already mentioned the idea of cryptocurrencies, please do get in touch with me. You're very welcome to do that, or with the team. Any of the usual ways. You can email us, you can contact me via LinkedIn. I wrote an article just this week on LinkedIn about FinTech in small firms and large firms. So there's lots of options. Getting in touch with us if there's anything that we can do to help. One very final question just before we close, and it's simply this: if you would like to hear more from us about regulatory updates, about any other information from CCL, all I'm going to do is, this is the one question that isn't anonymous, so you don't have to respond, but if you would like to hear from us, if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, I'm just going to put that up in front of you just for a moment or two, just as a chance for you to respond and to click on that. Obviously, even if you don't, you're very welcome still to get in touch with us, connect via LinkedIn, or however you wish to. Our time is very nearly gone. I'll just leave that for the last couple of seconds, but I really hope that's been a useful introduction. I appreciate it's only been an introduction, and it can only have been an introduction. Let me just close that. Okay. I really hope, though, that it has been a useful introduction to this topic. Please, as I've said, get in touch with us if there's anything else that you think we could help with. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you ever so much, everyone.